Makes me sick to my stomach.
Before becoming a mainstream film icon, Tim Burton was a totally out there TV director.
I'm Dan, the gingerbread man.
Who just so happened to create some of the strangest, creepiest, and most wild fairy tales television audiences had ever seen. But what was it about Burton's early work that was so boundary-pushing for the time?
Amazing.
And why have these episodes remained buried and forgotten for the last 35+ years? Well, today we find out as we rediscover 3 of the entries into the earliest and quite possibly wildest days of Tim Burton.
It all comes from the fact that I've always wanted to bring a little happiness into people's lives.
Now, if you watched my video on Tim Burton's absolutely insane version of Hansel and Gretel, you already know just how misunderstood and depressed he was while working at Disney.
And I would just do strange things. I would, sit under my desk, or I'd sit inside of a closet, or I got definitely stranger when I worked there.
And that he was eventually fired after Vincent, Hansel and Gretel, and Frankenweenie all failed to find the kind of mainstream audience that the House of Mouse desperately needed.
Look at that Mickey.
You're fired, Tim!
But it was Frankenweenie and Tim Burton's visual brand of gothic surrealism that caught the attention of Paul Reubens, who hired him to direct Pee-wee's Big Adventure.
I screened Frankenweenie, and after about the first minute of it, I thought, this is the guy.
And from there, Tim's career basically exploded, directing Beetlejuice, Batman, Edward Scissorhands, and Batman Returns, all in the span of about 5 years. But that's not the full story, because in between his first 2 breakout hits, Tim Burton worked on 3 iconic TV series that each gave us a very different look into his raw and unvarnished creativity.
Hello, I'm Shelley Duvall. I'd like to give you a brief glimpse at a project that I've been producing for the last 2 years called Fairy Tale Theater.
Fairy Tale Theater, you've had a lot of big stars to come on and do it for almost no money in comparison to what they get, Well,
I think all of the stars, a lot of the stars have kids and they like to do something for their kids. Some of the stars do some things that their kids can't see, so this was sort of a vacation. Also playing the classic roles, I think was very attractive, and I try to put a lot of quality on the screen, quality behind the cameras as well as in front.
Fairy Tale Theater was just about the perfect proving ground for a young Tim Burton. Having been fired from Disney in 1984 for consistently making fairy tales that were just too scary for kids, what better way to follow up all of that than directing a fairy tale TV series aimed at kids?
Over the centuries, there have been books and books and books written on fairy tales, and we recommend you read each and every one. But if you're looking for something a bit more unusual, why not try Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater?
Once upon a time. Once upon a time.
Shelley Duvall, seen here, has brought together many of her closest friends for fun and frivolity.
Hello.
Oh, a horrid toad!
Ooh, a nasty princess.
Classic fairy tales with a slightly twisted point of view.
What's your name? Snow White. What's yours?
Barbara?
Don't miss the fun-filled hours of family fare in Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater.
What Fairy Tale Theater did offer Tim was both a safe space and a champion. The series was being broadcast on Showtime, which at that point was still trying to find its footing when it came to original programming. It being a premium paid cable channel meant that it wasn't anywhere near as concerned about its family-friendly image as Disney.
Oh, it feels so good. So hot. I can't stand it. The heat is on.
More significant was the fact that the award-winning Fairy Tale Theater had been created by Hollywood darling Shelley Duvall. Not only had she starred in Burton's Frankenweenie, but also in oh so many absolutely iconic films of that era, such as Nashville, 3 Women, The Shining, Popeye, and Time Bandits.
Tell me a bit about the Time Bandits.
They wanted somebody with a terrible English accent, and here I am. I say, any chance of a rescue here? Is that pretty bad?
No, that's not bad at all. I mean, there's not much Texas in there, is there?
No. If they could only hear me now.
And when she eventually had the idea to produce her own show with Fairy Tale Theater, she called in every favor imaginable to fill out the cast and crew with a combination of Hollywood A-listers and up-and-comers.
And I've always had such a soft spot and admired Shelley Duvall so much. The first time I ever was hired to do something where it was starring Paul Rubens was Shelley Duvall's Fairy Tale Theater.
Which is how the series ended up with unforgettable moments like...
And if you don't turn back, then we'll know that you're all right.
Oh, yes, yes.
Well, all right.
All right.
Any change?
Not yet. Maybe we should give it a bit longer.
Or...
Hansel, what have you done with her?
Nothing. Compared to what I'm going to do to you.
Or even... And by the time Tim Burton was added to the mix, the series was past its midpoint and had already racked up multiple awards, including a Peabody in 1984. All of this to say that Fairy Tale Theater was already very well established when Tim began work on Aladdin and His Wonderful Lamp, all shortly before he got hired to direct Pee-wee's Big Adventure. This was both the best and quite possibly the worst thing that could have happened for Tim at this point in his career. On one hand, meant that he didn't have anywhere near the pressure on him that he had with his Disney shorts. The script had been written, the characters had been cast, and just about all of the artistic concepts and design had already been completed by the time he signed on. That's not to say that he didn't get any of that Tim Burton flair, but for the most part, Tim had just been hired to direct someone else's project. Unfortunately, this also meant that he had only a fraction of the creative control he enjoyed just a few short months earlier at Disney. But lucky for both Tim and us, Shelley Duvall's retelling of the classic Aladdin story came around just at the right time. And it has 3 unforgettable elements that make Tim Burton's episode of Fairy Tale Theater an absolute must-watch.
And look! Fresh air!
Now, if you were to imagine James Earl Jones as the genie in Aladdin, I wouldn't blame you for using adjectives like authoritative, wise, or badass. I mean, this is the voice of Darth Vader, Mufasa, the narrator of Judge Dredd.
They were the judges.
I am the law!
So it's safe to say, you weren't expecting this.
What if I choose instead to rearrange the features of your young face?
Jones plays this genie as a slightly nightmarish but completely unhinged version of the character.
And that's my mother. They're passed out from fright.
Amusing. Now, what is it you request? Oh, Aladdin of humble birth.
And to give him even more scenery to chew on, James Earl Jones actually gets to portray 2 genies, as this version of the classic tale reintroduces the magic ring and less intense genie that lives inside of it.
Greetings, friend.
Who are you?
I am Abdul, genie of the ring.
The other standout in this episode is none other than Mr. Spock himself, Leonard Nimoy.
Bilbo Baggins, the bravest little hobbit of them all.
Yeah, that Leonard Nimoy. And just like James Earl Jones, Nimoy seems to be having the time of his life hamming it up as the evil Moroccan magician who tricks Aladdin into fetching him the lamp.
The rest of you, disappear! 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 Nothing is sweeter than revenge.
And finally, there's Tim Burton's direction and overall style, which is all pretty reined in here. Except for one very Burton-esque scene, because as soon as Aladdin enters the Cave of Wonders, Tim's wild imagination has an all too brief moment to fully shine through. All of these pieces add up to exactly what you would hope, a modern and generally off-kilter take on the classic Aladdin fairy tale. The thing was, fairy tale theater being on Showtime meant that it had a very limited audience. And even though the original 27 episodes were eventually syndicated to various networks, like the Disney Channel and PBS, this didn't happen until almost a decade later. Even today, it's not an easy show to track down, with the DVDs being out of print and it no longer being available on any of the major streamers. Your best chance of revisiting this series is to turn to YouTube or the Internet Archive. For Tim Burton, it didn't take long for him to realize that a safe space like this just wasn't for him. In his 1995 autobiography, Tim describes how he personally just didn't have enough control over Aladdin to feel like he had much of a connection to the material. Though, much of this would change with his next TV project, where his unfiltered style, paired with some of his favorite collaborators, would play a major role in sending Tim Burton's career into the stratosphere.
Good evening. Of late, I have grown weary of being a sex symbol, and have decided to return to television.
Little did Tim Burton know at the time, but he had landed right in the center of the anthology series boom of the mid-1980s. George A. Romero's Tales from the Dark Side, Steven Spielberg's Amazing Stories, The New Twilight Zone, these were just a few of the examples of the types of series being broadcast at the time. And unlike fairy tale theater, these tended to be darker, edgier, and not exactly aimed at children. So when NBC was looking to relaunch Alfred Hitchcock Presents, they went with a laser-focused strategy. Find a fresh pool of promising up-and-comers who had just the right amount of availability in their schedule to produce something fast and relatively cheap. Someone like a young and unproven Tim Burton, who was still waiting for Pee-wee to hit theaters.
I have an announcement to make. Cold-blooded murder is more popular than ever. Touché.
Which isn't to say that the concept of this new Alfred Hitchcock Presents was entirely fresh, because rather than present brand new stories with a fresh Hitchcockian twist, the majority of the series was made up of modern remakes of episodes from the original Alfred Hitchcock Presents and the Alfred Hitchcock Hour series, which aired throughout the 50s and 60s. The upside of this was that NBC needed these newer episodes done fast and didn't have time to waste with heavy-handed creative oversight, which kind of worked in Tim Burton's favor, especially when his episode remake ended up being The Jar, a 1944 short story that Ray Bradbury had originally written for Weird Tales magazine. Tasked with updating the story were future Beetlejuice writers Michael McDowell and Larry Wilson. And Tim also made sure to surround himself with a comfort zone of a couple of his other favorite collaborators. Rick Heinrichs, who he had worked with throughout his time at Disney, was hired for the special effects. Then there was musician Danny Elfman, who had also just worked with Tim on Pee-wee and was still at the beginning of his legendary career in Hollywood.
I don't see enough bow ties around here. I think anybody not wearing one should be thrown out of here right now.
And with this creative team now in place, it's safe to assume that audiences had no idea that they were about to get a sneak peek into the style and tone of Burton's next big thing. When The Jar debuted in April of 1986, TV viewers were introduced to something very different. And this was true even if they had already seen the original episode or read the short story. What had originally been an episode that begins with a down-on-his-luck local yokel who purchases a jar and its mysterious contents from a carnival sideshow now featured Nazis. And instead of that down-on-his-luck local yokel, we get a down-on-his-luck artist whose recently launched art exhibition hasn't been going so well.
Mr. Knowles' work might best be described as an anesthetizing tour of the dark corners of the junkyard of bourgeois civilization.
But when Noel the artist discovers the mysterious jar in a junkyard and decides to put it on display, his fortunes quickly turn around. Audiences are absolutely hypnotized and drawn into its strangeness.
It's the most wonderful thing I've ever seen.
Well, everyone but Noel's not very supportive wife who's been having an affair with one of her friends. But when she has the bright idea to inspect the contents of the jar more closely, things don't quite turn out as expected.
What have you done?
And for Noel's wife, I guess you can say that she gets closer to the jar than anyone would ever want to.
Well, wherever she is, I'm sure she'll find her niche in the art world.
Oh, you're much kinder than I could be, dear boy. But I must say, your homage to her is inspired. There's no other word.
Yes, I'm proud of it myself. And as you say, I was inspired.
Now, right from the start, the jar offers up one big stylistic taste of what Burton, McDowell, Wilson, and Elfman would give us just 2 years later with Beetlejuice. Everything from the character design, to the rich, contrasty lighting, to the haunting, whimsical beat of the musical score.
I wish I could create something with its power.
Whether Tim Burton knew it at the time, the jar wasn't just work for hire, done to pay the bills. Just as it wasn't any old episode of a rarely remembered TV series. The jar was a test bed, where Tim could continue to explore his darker side with like-minded collaborators, all while further distancing himself from the restrictive embrace of the mouse. But then, Pee-wee's Big Adventure released, and it was a massive commercial success, but not quite as well loved from critics.
Critics divided at the time it grew on people.
It was on some of the 10 worst films of the year. My friend, that and Beetlejuice are on the 10 worst films of the year list.
People are catching up to you. It takes them a while.
Just seemed to me too predictable, and the nya fights back and forth got to me. I can't recommend it.
I don't know. I think you kind of have to be in a certain state of mind to take Pee Wee Herman, and to be sure,
in the long
feature length, there's a lot of Pee Wee Herman.
Yes.
On the other hand, for the first time in his career, Tim Burton was finally seen as bankable. Executives were now coming to him with ideas.
Well, I was offered a talking horse movie.
But he's about to get some badly needed help.
Fred, we've got to talk.
Straight from the horse's mouth.
Which I turned down.
But he also knew that he had to be careful. A box office dud, even after the success of Pee-wee, would likely put just about any director back at square one. And so rather than rush out and do whatever the studio threw at him, Tim went the other direction and slowed things down, eventually re-teaming with his creative crew from The Jar to develop Beetlejuice. But while still in early development on The Ghost with the Most, Tim got a call from one of his old CalArts University friends. And it was this call that would put Tim Burton on a collision course with one of the biggest forces in Hollywood.
I thought I'd leave you with a brief preview of Steven Spielberg's Back to the Future. Actually, that's not quite right. Spielberg was only one of 3 executive producers. The director of the film, who should take the credit, was Robert Zemeckis, who also co-wrote the script. And yet the power of Spielberg's name is such that these days any film with which he's associated seems to become automatically a colossal box office hit.
Now, for the last entry in the wild world of early Tim Burton on TV, we've got to go back to his time at the California Institute of the Arts, in the Disney-sponsored character animation program.
CalArts will be a functional workshop planned for inspiration and creation. Enrollment will be based on artistic achievement and talent potential. Thus, the caliber of students will be top grade.
Not only was it here that Tim was recognized for his off-kilter artistic design and hired to work on The Fox and the Hound, but at both CalArts and Disney, he was also surrounded by other like-minded artists, many of which would also go on to bigger and better things in the animation world. One of these artists was Brad Bird, who would later go on to direct animated classics like The Iron Giant, The Incredibles, and Ratatouille. But in the late 70s, Brad was still an up-and-comer who, unfortunately, had arrived at Disney during quite possibly the darkest moment in the animation studio's history. This kind of environment led to many of the young animators working on their own personal projects, using their creative ideas that fell outside of the Disney norm. One of Brad Bird's ideas was for a series featuring a domesticated dog and its misadventures with its very off-kilter family.
When he was at Disney, he was in the same Cal Arts class as Tim Burton. And Tim Burton was at Disney at the same time Brad was there. Brad was always an admirer of Tim's design style. Somewhere along the line, Tim drew a drawing of the dog, and it was just like a throwaway drawing. I don't know, how that came about or something. And Brad thought, oh, that's such a great design. It's such a unique looking thing, and no one's ever done anything in this style.
Not too long afterwards, both Brad and Tim found themselves out of a job at Disney, and so Brad continued to flesh out his family dog concept into a short demo reel, featuring even more design work by Tim. This demo reel eventually found itself on the desk of Steven Spielberg, whose Amblin Entertainment had just launched a television division to produce amazing stories. Spielberg instantly saw promise in both Brad and his idea of a story centered on a dog's perspective of a dysfunctional suburban family. But the original pitch was for it to be developed into a theatrical short, something that Spielberg felt was an antiquated model with no viable economic upside. But he still hired Brad as a writer on Amazing Stories. And it was only after penning his own well-received episode of that series that Brad was given a crew of 21 people, $1 million, and just under a year to bring his vision of Family Dog to the small screen.
Amazing Stories is about to introduce your family to a new friend, the Family Dog. Monday.
When Family Dog premiered in Season 2 of Amazing Stories, it was able to fulfill much of the promise Spielberg had seen in Brad's original concept. It felt playful, fresh, stylish, it had an edge, and it looked like nothing else that was on primetime TV.
He's whizzing on the carpet, Dad.
Brad had once again called his old friend Tim Burton to help with more artistic design, and along with him came Danny Elfman to provide music. All of this helped Family Dog to feel truly cinematic, and not like any other animated series at the time, a majority of which were all cartoons aimed at kids. This was still a couple of months before the original Simpsons shorts started airing on The Tracy Ullman Show, and over 2 years before The Simpsons got their own series. And while the Family Dog episode was well received, and technically still cost less than a typical episode of Amazing Stories, everyone behind the scenes had a difficult time agreeing on what to do next with these characters. On one side, Spielberg hoped to position another project under Amblin Television's umbrella with a Family Dog TV series. On the other side, Brad vehemently pushed to maintain the high-quality bar the team had already established, and felt like the only way to do this was with a feature film. And while Spielberg wasn't totally against the idea, I'll bet you can't guess which direction the studio decided to go.
So they kind of got into it, and then they were still offering him to do a series, and Brad was like kept pleading with them, look, you can't I can't write all these episodes and retain the characters and the humor and the writing that I want at this pace. And we're never going to get the animation that look the same way too, because it'll all have to be farmed out overseas. So he ended up passing on it.
But you know who was on board for the animated series? Tim Burton. Well, sort of. You see, at the time Family Dog the series was going into production, Tim already had both Beetlejuice and Batman under his belt, and was kind of a big deal. And so his contribution mostly came through lending his production company and his name, which didn't sit all that well with Brad.
And then it was a little funky because they started giving Tim Burton more credit than was deserved. Even though Tim had designed the characters, he wasn't really responsible for the writing and direction of that. That was all Brad, right? So they went ahead and did this thing anyway, and Brad was super depressed about it because he kind of had a falling out with Spielberg at that time, which had since been patched up, but at the time it was like really tough on Brad.
But hey, we still got a new animated series being created under the watchful eyes of Steven Spielberg and Tim Burton. What could possibly go wrong?
On June 23rd, CBS will unleash television's newest star. He's fierce, he's powerful, he's dangerous, and he's almost housebroken. Family Dog from Steven Spielberg and Tim Burton.
It turns out a whole lot. A slew of production problems meant that Family Dog the series didn't premiere on CBS until June of 1993, 2 years late and 6 full years after the original Amazing Stories short. And worst of all, the series didn't last long. Critics unanimously called out the series' clear shift to cheaper-looking animation, lack of humor, and flat-out boring plots. Ratings were even worse, and CBS quickly canceled the series, airing the episodes in 1-hour-long blocks over a 5-week stretch in the summer. More embarrassing, though, is the fact that the series had a whole line of merchandise attached to it, and much of it had just been sitting in the warehouse collecting dust over the 2 years that the Family Dog series had been delayed. For Brad Bird, this was a bit of an I told you so moment, but it had also led to a rift between him and Spielberg. He left Amblin Animation in 1989, and soon found himself working on a little show you may have heard of. Before bouncing around various projects, until he was able to convince Warner Brothers to let him make a little movie you may have heard of.
Giant?
Oh, God.
Steven Spielberg did end up producing other animated feature films, just with a different former House of Mouse animator, and they even wound up going toe-to-toe with Disney and beating them at their own game with their own mouse. And for Tim Burton, who had been off working on Edward Scissorhands throughout much of the Family Dog drama, he was far from done with animation, far from done dealing with creator controversy, and far from done with dogs. And with Tim revisiting Beetlejuice in his upcoming sequel, surely he must be fondly remembering the TV projects that got him there, right?
For 3 years after Pee-wee, which had put you on the map in a big way, you're off the screen. There was not another film. What was going on during those years?
I don't know. It's weird. It's hard for me to account for my time. I don't know. I mean, I was trying to do things, but I don't know. I've been quite lucky. I've been very lucky to do things, but then people are always slightly concerned about me for some reason. I don't know. I don't really know why.
But this is hardly the first time that we've uncovered the buried nightmares or controversial classics of Tim Burton. Make sure to check these out if you want to see more of the wild side of him.